Let's go over the RAID. What exactly a RAID is? A RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks, or sometimes often referred to as inexpensive disk. And RAID, why do we need RAID? Well, to create a redundancy, meaning if one disk dies, you have another disk, right? You don't want to lose your data if one of your primary disks dies. So that's the primary reason we have RAID. And there are different type of RAIDs. The main ones that we will cover in this lesson are three RAIDs: RAID 0, 1, and 5. And how do they work? Let's go over them. In RAID 0, you have one disk that is, let's say, 5 gig. You add another disk that becomes 10 gig. So you put them together and that 5 plus 5 becomes 10 gig, right? Perfect. So you are writing to both disk, one here, one there. It's going across. It's faster, of course. But what happens if you lose one disk? Well, you're out of luck. Why? Because you have lost all your data. So there is, most of the time, RAID 0 is used for like data warehousing or backups that you rarely gonna use. So things like that. So you do need to add a couple of physical disks together to make one big disk. That's how RAID 0 is mostly used. Let's talk about RAID 1. That will eliminate the disadvantage of RAID 0 where we lose one disk and then you're out of luck. In RAID 1, you have one disk and then you have another disk, but you mirror them together. Meaning if you have 5 gig of space on one, you have to have 5 gig on the other one. But that does not mean you're going to have 10 gig together, because you're not adding them together. You are mirroring them together. So if you lose one disk, that's fine. You still get your data from the other disk. But there is another disadvantage to RAID 1, and that is slow. It is slow because it has to replicate everything from one disk to another, so that sometimes gets a slow read and slow writes. Then to solve all these problems, 0 and 1, what do we do then? 0, 1 has we have a risk to lose data. RAID 1, we have slow read and write, so we come up with RAID 5. In RAID 5, you have one disk, right? Then you have another disk, but this time you don't just add to it, you actually copy everything to the second one as well. But in RAID 5, you have to have 3 or more disks. Why? Because the way RAID 5 works is it will write to the first disk and it will put some information about that data to the second disk. It will write to the second disk and it will put some of that information that it has written to the third disk. And it goes around like a round robin like that. So in case you lose one disk, which doesn't matter if it's the first, second, or third, you will have the information of the lost data on one of the disks that you still have. That's how you create RAID 5. But in this case, you're not going to have like 55515 because you have to write some of the disk information that's parity to some other disk as well. So this way you could retrieve that information. So in order to put that information somewhere, it needs to reserve that space for it. And that's why we get out of it like 12 or 13 gig of space. So that's how RAID works, and the reason I am covering RAID in this training is because that's one of the very basic questions often been asked during interviews. And as a system administrator, when you do become a system administrator in Linux environment, you will have to create RAID at a hardware level. When you have a server coming into your corporate environment, you will have to configure RAID. And the primary difference between RAID and LVM is that RAID is mostly configured on the physical system, physical servers, and sorry, not physical, physical disks, whereas LVM is mostly configured on a virtual or logical disks. So that's a primary difference. So please remember it. If you want to learn more about other RAIDs, I will encourage you to go online and find out about other RAIDs.